I don't hear you.
Sorry, yeah. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. Being the professional broadcaster I am, I put my mic on mute, which is the first time I've ever done that. And I just thought because it must annoy my guests if they hear me tapping away on the keyboard. But just tell you guys a little bit about today's guest. In 2006, before I'd become a fully published author, I had the opportunity to go to a scientific and medical network meeting in Lancashire, where I used to live in the northwest of England. And I was particularly interested in going along to this because I had been in contact with a fascinating near-death researcher called Evelyn Elsaesser, who is based in Geneva. And Evelyn was talking at this particular event. And it's one of these sets of circumstances where you come along and you immediately relate to somebody. And it was almost instantaneous. As soon as Evelyn and I started chatting, I knew that she was going to be a friend of mine for a long time. And indeed, a previous guest on this show, Bill Murtha, was also involved in that meeting that day. And what Evelyn had to say about the near-death experiences, I found absolutely extraordinary. And it really intrigued me, her work. And subsequently then, Evelyn was really kind enough to invite me to speak at the Scientific and Medical Network in Geneva. And I did a talk over there and stayed with Evelyn in a lovely house just on the nearby to the banks of Lake Geneva. And subsequent to this, Evelyn was very much the person who facilitated my contact directly with Engelbert Winkler and Dr. Engelbert Winkler and Dr. Dirk Prokol, who are the inventors of the Lucia light device. And we all know how interesting that development has come about. But without Evelyn, this would not have happened. And my first experience was actually at Evelyn's home when the guys brought in the machine to show me how it worked and everything else as well. So I owe her such a debt. But I also owe her a debt for another thing, because of one of my favorite books, and I strongly advise if you can get a hold of a copy of this, if you are interested in near-death experiences, this is a fictional account that Evelyn wrote, a book called Talking with Angel. And I have to say that even now, when I reread this book, and I've read it 5 or 6 times now, it always makes me cry. And I think that imagery, and Evelyn and I have discussed the imagery of it, and it is so, so powerful. It is a powerful book and well worth reading. But the reason that Evelyn is with us today is from some of her recent work. I'll just tell you a little bit about her as a background. She's an expert on near-death related experiences, notably near-death experiences and spontaneous and direct after-death communications, also known as ADCs. She's the author of numerous books, articles, and book chapters on these topics. She's the project leader of an international research project entitled Investigations of the Phenomenology and Impact of Spontaneous and Direct After-Death Communications. She's also co-founder and member of the executive board of the Swiss IANS, International Association for Near-Death Studies, and she has served for many years as the coordinator of the Swiss branch of the Scientific and Medical Network. Evelyn, welcome to the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour.
Hello, Tony. Thank you so much for your kind words. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's really wonderful, really wonderful. So let's go straight in. I'm really intrigued about your new project and what you've been involved in, because we've only got an hour. So I'm really interested. Can you tell us what you've been working on recently?
Yes. So we are a team of 4 researchers. Professor Chris Rowe and Dr. Callum Cooper from the University of Northampton, UK.
Yeah, Callum has been a previous guest on this show as well, so that's
excellent. So everybody knows him. David Lorimer, of course, of the Scientific and Medical Network, and myself. So we are 4 persons in this team. Sometimes we collaborate with other researchers from other universities, but the core team are the 4 of us. And we have finished the first part of our research project. As you said, it's the investigation of the phenomenology and impact of direct and spontaneous after-death communications. We now have received 2 additional grants. So this will be a 5-year project, and we have started the second phase, which will be finished in 2024. So what we did a very, very large survey with more than 1,000 participants, to be precise, 1,004 persons have completed a questionnaire which you have designed, a very long, very detailed questionnaire of close to 200 questions in the 3 project languages, in English, French, and Spanish. So we now have the largest database on spontaneous after-death communications worldwide. And of course, we have started publishing. We had several scientific papers published in scientific journals, and I have written a book presenting the research findings, illustrated by numerous accounts of our participants, which has been already published in several languages. So we go on with our research. We will replicate the survey using, of course, the same questionnaire to allow us to compare the data. It will soon be replicated in German and in Dutch, and then other language groups will be added. So this is a very extensive survey, the most extensive one worldwide on spontaneous after-death communications. You see, after-death communications are very, very frequent. Research says that 50 to 60% of people have those experiences. Most of them are bereaved, but not all of them. You can very, very well have an after-death communication when you're not bereaved. And this very beautiful, very moving, very transformative phenomenon, which is so current, has been very little researched. So this is why we have started this research project, because people have those experiences. They don't easily talk about it because people normally don't understand it. They don't match the materialistic conception of reality, because, you know, in our Western societies, people think once you're dead, you're dead. So it's impossible to perceive a deceased loved one. And yet people have those experiences every day, and on all continents, and for centuries, accounts have been collected. But this phenomenon has been very little researched. So our aim, the aim of our project, is to understand better those experiences, but also to allow people to speak about it more easily, more freely. If people have the information, when they live it themselves, they know what is happening to them. And if somebody tells them about the experience they had, they will understand it more easily. They can talk about it. They can share this experience with others more easily, which is not really the case currently. And that can be difficult for people because they're so happy. They're so happy to have received their deceased husband, their deceased mother. It was such a beautiful experience, and they would like to share it, but it's not easy in our societies.
So when we talk about the concept of ADCs,
yes,
what do we mean? How do they occur? And what kind of different messages are received?
ADCs are spontaneous, allegedly initiated by the deceased without intention or solicitation from the people who have those experiences. We call them the experience. They are direct, without the help of a medium. So it's between the deceased and the experience directly. There is no intermediary involved, and without the use of devices like instrumental transcommunication, ITC, which is quite well known, or any other use of devices. It is an experience which is spontaneous and direct. It can be perceived by 4 of the 5 senses. You can hear a deceased, you can see a deceased, that's then an apparition. You can feel a physical contact, you can feel touched by a deceased loved one, for example, who gives you a kiss or who takes your hand. And you can smell a fragrance which is characteristic for the deceased and which the experience immediately associate with the deceased person. The most common type of ADCs are ADCs during sleep, when falling asleep or waking up. But in our study, we saw that 52% of them were woken up by their experience. And afterwards, it was another type of experience. They saw the deceased, they heard the deceased, and so on. And very common also is an experience of simply sensing the presence of the deceased. They don't hear them, they don't see them, they don't feel them, but they know they are here. They know they are in the room. They know when they come and they know exactly when they leave. So this is also, it is as beneficial and important for the experienced experience if they see the deceased, which is of course impressive, an apparition, or if they just sense their presence. It seems to have the same impact. There is no graduation of importance for the people who have the experience. It's the fact of having had this contact with a deceased loved one, which is important. So very often several sensory organs are involved simultaneously. And if this is fine with you, Tony, I would like to read just a short account.
Absolutely.
Of one of our participants, which illustrates very well that several sensory organs are involved simultaneously. The most significant was June 12, 2012. I was awakened around 6 a.m. in the morning. I saw someone walking on my front porch through my bedroom window. I thought, who would be here this early? I got dressed and went to the front door. I opened the door and saw a woman with her back to me on my left, crying. I asked if she was okay. She turned around and it was my grandmother from my father's side of the family. I was in shock to see her. She spoke and asked me for forgiveness and apologized for no longer talking to me after my father had passed away. I told her it was okay and I forgave her. She walked towards me and we hugged. I felt her frail body hug me and I hugged her back. I felt her clothes, her smell, and she thanked me as we hugged. I felt this most intense feeling of love. I started to cry. She then started to turn into this bright white light. I had to close my eyes due to it being so bright. I could see the light fading away through my eyelids. The feeling of her started to slowly leave. I opened my eyes and she was gone. I was standing there with my arms still looking like I was hugging someone. I was in shock. I went back into the house and lay on my bed and my wife woke up. I told her what had happened. My grandmother had been dead for about 7 years.
Extraordinary.
It is, isn't it? And you can see that this man, he could see her, he had a conversation with her, he felt her, he hugged her. So these are very, very, very complete experiences. It's much more than just a very brief perception of the deceased, even though the experiences are normally very short, a couple of seconds, sometimes a couple of minutes. But so much happens, and it's not just a perception, it's about information, like the message he received from her, the request for forgiveness, and it is about emotions, because he said, I felt this most intense love from her to him, and probably also from him to her. So I think this is a very good example. We have many of them, but it shows well how these experiences unfold.
Do you have experiences that you already intrigued me, and I'm already going to go off piste really on this one already because it's quite fascinating. Is it ordinarily just one contact? In other words, that there's one contact and they never see the deceased person again, or do they come back again? Have you got cases where the person has come back on repeated occasions?
Yes, so we thought it would be probably only once or twice, but in our survey, we were amazed to see that 80% of our participants had several ADCs. We didn't expect that. That's not what the literature said. So that was an interesting research finding we had. It's normally, for those who had several ADCs, normally between 2 and 5, 6 as an average, but some of them had more than that over the years. Well, these experiences, half of them occur in the first year after the demise, with a strong concentration in the first 24 hours and up to 7 days. Then they can occur later, of course, in a decrease in frequency from 2 to 5 years. Later, it's more rare. They can still occur, but they are then often of the type, what we call ADCs for warning and protection, when somebody receives a warning for an imminent danger, which then allows them to avoid this danger, like a fire, it can be an accident, a drowning, and so on. So they receive the information, be careful, something really bad is going to happen. You can avoid it, you know, be careful. For example, I think of a man who told us that he was sleeping when he had an ADC during sleep with his deceased mother, who told him, your house is on fire, take the kids and your wife, get out of the house. And in fact, yes, indeed, his house was on fire. This is what we call an ADC for warning and protection. So these experiences can take decades, place decades after the demise. But I would say any type of ADC can occur much later, but half of them occur in the first year after the demise.
Interesting. And in terms of the way in which the deceased person presents themselves, it's interesting or it intrigues me, and I'd be interested to have your opinion on this, as to why it is that, I think I know why, but why it is you think that the deceased person will always present themselves presumably as the receiver remembers them being. You mentioned, for instance, earlier on about the grandmother appearing. She would have appeared as a little old lady and she was frail and everything else, but one assumes that in her worldview, in her percept world, she is all herself, isn't she? Because she had been a young woman and her time and everything else, but she presents in a specific way. I'd be interested to know your feelings on that.
Well, it looks like the deceased can materialize themselves in a way so that the experience can recognize them immediately. But what we found in our survey is that quite a big percentage perceived the deceased as being younger, as the day when they died, and in perfect health. If somebody died when they were old, they had an illness, they were, you know, in very bad shape physically, very often they see them in their best years, maybe when they were 40, they were happy, they were healthy, and that's the perception they have of them. So as if the deceased could choose under which form they present themselves to their loved ones, but always in a way which helps the person to identify them immediately.
Yes, that makes so much sense, doesn't it? That
it does.
Circumstances where if you wouldn't recognize your own mother when she was young, well, you probably may do in some way, but not immediately, whereas you need to. So there's almost a kind of projection into the consciousness of the perceiver, isn't there? It's as if the actual the physical abilities of us to perceive external reality is manipulated in some way for us to perceive the person in the way we'd like to perceive them. I'm also intrigued about the comment about the abilities that the person coming back seems to know the future. I mean, you mentioned this earlier. Can you give any more examples of this? Because this intrigues me, because this suggests that they are in a timeless state whereby they know the future. They're aware of what is about to happen.
And this has so many consequences.
Yes,
for our own life.
Yeah.
Yes, so we have some of those cases for the messages which involve previously unknown information. These are very interesting for us because they're evidential. If somebody receives an information they didn't have before, which can be verified and it proves to be true, then this is a veridical ADC. So we have some accounts in our database when people had an ADC for a future event. it's quite often the announcement of a death of a family member or friend. They learn that somebody they love, who is close to them, will die soon. Even if the person was not ill, was not elderly, maybe then afterwards they died in a car accident or they had a heart attack. When the demise was not predictable, they received this information. Now we can ask ourselves, what is the sense of this? Of course, the demise cannot be avoided, but the person is informed of it, so maybe they can, finish, fix a relationship. If they had some unfinished business, they can maybe talk about it. They can have a last word, a good conversation, a last word of love, and so on. So it is good to know that somebody is going to pass, even though it's not so easy to hear it. If it's somebody you love, it's an information that's maybe not so joyful for you, but it is still useful, but maybe because you can maybe have important last conversations with these persons. What also happens in these announcements of future events, sometimes happy events are announced, like I think of a man who had an ADC when he was sleeping with his deceased father, who told him that his daughter was pregnant. So he didn't know it, and his daughter didn't know it either, because she didn't want to have any more children. And in fact, yes, she was pregnant. So this is the kind of previously unknown information for future events, which can be perceived during an after-death communication.
Do we have any objective veridical proof of this, in the sense of somebody is given this information by a person and then subsequently they tell somebody else and then subsequently it comes to pass?
Exactly. So I have chosen a short account illustrating this case. My husband heard the voice of my deceased mother on several occasions. One occasion was when he was worried when a box of controlled drugs, we own a pharmacy, went missing, and he spent days searching the stockroom and controlled drugs cabinet. He went in on a Sunday for one last look before having to report it. He was upstairs just staring at the cabinet when he heard my mom say, "Look behind the radiator." He reached down behind, and wedged in there was the box of diamorphine. So this is a previously unknown information. This poor man has been searching for this box of medication for days, and he didn't find it. And he could immediately verify that the information he became was veridical, was true.
Intriguing, because this again suggests some kind of ability to observe what's happening in whatever we call consensual reality. There seems to be a kind of an observational ability to not just know the future, but also know the location of things in three-dimensional space, which again is extremely intriguing, isn't it? It suggests that a different form of perceptual abilities is taking place here. Now, go on, please.
Yes, that makes me think of what NDEers tell us about this universal knowledge they had during their near-death experience, like they had access to all the information, they knew it all. When they came back, they tend to have forgotten part of it. They just know that they knew, but they don't have the content anymore. But this is, in fact, this makes me think of a universal knowledge, because this deceased person had the knowledge, I mean, for small things and probably also for the very big and important things.
Yeah, because this reminds me, the classic Chaffin will case, which is used as evidence in terms of information being perceived from elsewhere. Now, I'd like to just pursue, before we go back to the general questions, there's another area I'd like to pursue here, because it's an area of interest for myself, and I know it's an area of interest from Sarah's point of view and other researchers I know, is the way in which you mentioned that it seems that these perceptions normally are facilitated in the liminal spaces between sleep and awake. you know, either in hypnagogia or hypnopompia, where it seems that the channels of communication are more open when we're about to go to sleep or about to wake. In terms of your percentage of cases, how many of them, in general terms, were facilitated in that way?
62% of our participants had their ADC when they fell asleep, were sleeping, or were waking up. But as I said earlier, 52 of them, so more than half of them, were woken up by the experience, which then went on.
It's as if, you know, the liminal state facilitates the communication, and then it carries on.
It carries on when they are
environment. Yeah.
When they are awake. That's interesting. I mean, if all the ADCs happened in these states of sleeping, waking up, falling asleep, then it would be a different type of phenomenon. But it's not the case. What we saw, we also asked them, what did you do immediately before the experience occurred? Were you thinking about a deceased person? Were you maybe crying, depressed? No, a huge percentage was busy with their life. They were working, they were driving, they were cooking. They were not thinking of the deceased person at the very moment when the contact occurred. That's also interesting.
That's so important, isn't it? It means you're not willing it into existence.
You cannot will it.
Communicating with you. Sarah, I know that you'll probably be quite interested coming in with your research in terms of dreams and everything else as well. Any observations at this point?
There was one question I wanted to ask you, Evelyn, about the nature of the relationships when these ADCs are most common. Do they happen most in particular kinds of relationships, mother and children, or long-term husband and wife situations?
Yes, I have a table in my book presenting the type of relation they had with the deceased. In the very, very large majority, it's family, partners, spouse, children if they were unfortunate enough to have lost a child. It's really family, friends, colleagues, just people they know without being very close to them. It's only a very small percentage. We also asked what was your emotional bond with the person. So more than 3/4 were very close and loving. So the love between the deceased and the personalized experience seems to be a very important trigger for those experiences to occur. But what is interesting, we also had small percentages, like 1 or 2%, when the relationship was difficult, you know, or maybe even extremely difficult. And then the contact served for a request for forgiveness. A healing could occur during this experience. I have in mind the case of somebody who said, if I had not had this experience with my deceased father, I would have remained in anger with him forever because we had a very difficult relationship. We didn't get along at all. And we even had, a quarrel shortly before he died, and that made me feel also very guilty. But during this contact, I felt his love. We could talk about what happened, and then the healing was complete, and I could start going through my bereavement process under much better conditions. So if the relationship was very difficult, the contact can help healing the relationship after the demise. Imagine you can still make peace, ask for forgiveness, being forgiven once the person had died. This is interesting.
It's something I'm also very interested in, researching lucid dreams, because it's something that I come across a lot, and I do think it's one of the best aspects of lucid dreaming, that it provides you with this opportunity to make peace and resolve conflicts with people that you are, especially in the case of death, not able to do in real life. But what really separates this for you from a internally generated sort of self-originated dream contact for emotional healing? that you do have in lucid dreams that does make you feel better, that what makes you sure that these figures aren't dream characters that are there to facilitate you feeling better?
Well, because half of them were woken up and the experience went on. So it was not a dream. It is not a dream. They say it was not a dream. I was sleeping, yes, but it was very different from a dream. It was much more real, it was more impacting, it was more memorable, and it was much more important to me than any dream could ever have been. So they say, no, it was not a dream. So what makes me think it is not a dream image? What did you say? A dream image or a dream experience?
I wonder
that most of them are not sleeping when it occurs.
Yeah, but are many of your participants lucid dreamers and familiar with the intensity of a lucid dream in comparison with a regular dream?
We didn't ask this question, so we don't know.
Okay.
We don't know, but we have a very huge sample, more than 1,000 persons. I don't know what's the percentage of people who know and who practice lucid dreaming. I don't know.
Because it's an interesting question. One of my friends, Paul Sinclair, has asked a question which I think is quite an important one. And Paul asked, do you think the experience is stronger when the experiencer is in a heightened emotional state due to a recent bereavement? And do the chances after death contact dissipate over time? That's interesting, isn't it? Does the bereavement facilitate contact?
Yeah, this is very, very interesting. So what I can reply to this is that 27% of our participants were not mourning anymore, or have never been mourning the person perceived. And 12% perceived a deceased person they didn't even know. So I can give you the figures of one of the questions we asked, which will answer the question you just asked me. So we asked them, in what state of bereavement were you when the contact happened? Extremely sad and in deep mourning, 36%. Moderately sad and moderately mourning, 14%. A little sad, but having partially overcome the pain of mourning, 17%. Not sad and not mourning anymore, 13%. I have never been in mourning of the perceived deceased, 14%, and unsure, 6%. So it's not a majority who was deeply mourning, not at all. And I think that is interesting. And as we know, you can also perceive a deceased person you didn't know. Of course, you're not mourning of somebody you don't know. But even, well, I can give you some other examples who show that bereavement cannot be the trigger for several types of ADCs. For example, during an ADC at the time of death, that's very interesting. Somebody, let's say, wakes up during the night and sees his or her mother in front of them.
Interestingly enough, Evelyn, one of our regulars here and is regular on the show, Myron Dial, has made exactly this comment where he says that my mother had her dead sister visiting her while she was during housework. This was at the moment of her death, 3,000 miles away.
Exactly.
Okay, but please go on about that.
Yes, so this person doesn't know yet that the person is deceased, since it is the person, him or herself, who tells him or her, I'm dying or have just died, I came to say goodbye. So the experience are not grieving, not yet grieving when they have the contact. During an ADC for a third person, we have, that is quite frequent, and that somebody perceives a deceased person whom they know, but they're not very close. Sometimes they don't even know them, and they perceive a communication for the family of the recently deceased person. So they tell him or her, could you please tell my family that I am fine, I have survived death, I'm happy. Tell them to stop crying, they don't need to be so sad, I'm well. So the person who has the experience is not grieving, but receives a message for somebody who is grieving. Then we have ADCs for protection and warning, that which I mentioned earlier, which can occur many years, decades after the demise. And of course, the ADCs with unknown deceased person. You're not mourning somebody you don't know. So in all these cases, grief cannot be the trigger for the experience.
I think that is crucially important, isn't it? You know, because one can assume that in a period of grief, you know, you're more open to these things. And, you know, the point being made, you know, the channels of communication may be more open.
Yeah, but that's not the way it works. As you said before, Tony, you cannot will it.
Yes.
You know, the difficulty is that when people are bereaved, they would like so much to have a last contact. They would really like this to happen. And it doesn't happen. Maybe it will happen later. We don't know. We don't know why many people have ADCs, but many others don't. We don't know it. But you cannot make it happen just because you would like it to happen. So I think this is a very important point.
Because that go on, Sarah.
Sorry, I ask one question before I forget about it. The warnings that people are receiving, are they mostly during sleep? Like you mentioned, the guy whose house was on fire, or they could be anytime?
They can be any type. And you know, I have an interesting case in mind. Well, normally people, when they have those perceptions, then they follow the warning and they don't do what might put them in imminent or even fatal danger. So they take it on board. But we have the case in our database of a woman who said she had this perception. She learned that she would have a very bad car accident, but she didn't really trust her perceptions. So she took the car, but she didn't take her daughter with her, because she had this feeling, you know, maybe something will happen, but I want to go there, I need to go there, I will take the car, but I will not take my daughter. And she had a very, very, very bad accident, and she was in hospital for several months. So that's interesting.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Intriguing.
Like half believing it and saving your daughter, but putting yourself in the line of fire.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, for example, this contact did not happen when she was sleeping. So it can be for any type of ADC. You can have an ADC for warning and protection.
So in terms of this, it's all very intriguing as to what impact do you think that ADCs have on our belief systems?
Yes, we have, of course, looked into this question, which is a very, very important one. Well, these are not religious experiences, so the impact on the religiosity is very, very small. Almost no change in the religiosity of our participants after the contact. But the impact on spirituality is huge, because it doubles after an ADC. Then, of course, we have the belief in life after death. So what is important to stress is that you do not need to believe in life after death to have an ADC. Whatever your belief system, if you think once you're dead, you know, it's all over, you can still have. You have the same probability of having an ADC than if you're convinced that there is life after death. So in our survey, after the experience, 93% believed in an afterlife, 6% were unsure, and only 1% did not believe in it. So this is interesting to see how much impact those experiences have on the belief system of the people. Then they are completely convinced that the deceased can contact the living, since they had an experience themselves, and only 1% is not convinced that deceased person can contact living persons. Interesting also is the impact on the fear of death. We know how important and how deeply, I don't find the word, no, I don't find the word, doesn't matter. Fear of death is in our subconscious all the time. Even if you don't want to admit it, the fear of death is a very difficult thing human beings have to live with. So we asked, did your after-death communication have any impact on your fear of death? And yes, it did. For 31%, it was decreased. And for 30%, it disappeared. It remained the same for 33%, and it increased for 1% and unsure 5%. So I have two short accounts of our participants concerning the fear of death. One wrote, my perception changed from one of fear and dread to one of fearless acceptance and joyful wonderment at the grand plan. And another one who was probably in the group that said it has decreased but not completely disappeared, he said it lessened my strong fear of death. So this is important for our daily life, for our, for our view of life and death. It's very important if our fear of death can decrease or even disappear. So this is a very strong impact also we have seen in our survey. Yeah.
I find it extraordinary that the 1% who must be suffering from extreme cognitive dissonance, they have this experience and reject it. Have you any more information as to why, even when they've had these experiences, they still reject it? Have you any idea or thoughts as to why that would be?
Well, you see, there are many analyses we can still do and will still do to find out exactly what happened. Why did these participants have this or that answer? We haven't done that yet. We have done it for part of our database. We have done all the quantitative analysis that is done for the 1,004 participants. But there's all this thematic or qualitative analysis which is still on the way. And as I mentioned, we also collaborate with teams from other universities, from France and from the United States, on specific questions. So this would be typically a specific question we could look into. Why did 1% not trust their perception? Because this is exactly what happened. They had the experience, but they didn't believe that it was real. But talking about that, I want also to speak about the impression of reality people have of their experience, because I think this is very important.
Yes.
So the objective of our work, of our survey, was not to try to investigate are ADCs authentic or not. We didn't make a study on the ontological status of after-death communications. What we did is examine and investigate the experience people have. What happened to them? And we have all those information now on the unfolding of the after-death communications, on the different types of ADCs and so on. And what did it change in their life, for their belief system, for the process of bereavement? This was our work, the experience of the people. But we have one question when we ask them, what is your impression of the reality of your experience? Do you think it was real? Or do you think it was maybe due to your grief or a hallucination or whatever? So this is interesting. I will give you their replies. So was authentic beyond doubt, 90%. Could possibly really have happened, 8%. It is unlikely that it was authentic, 0%. Was certainly not authentic, but rather a hallucination or illusion created by grief, 0%. And unsure, 1%. So this sums up to 99% because we have rounded the percentages for ease of reading. But you see, 90% say it was authentic beyond doubt, and 8% said it possibly really could have happened. This is impressive.
It is indeed. And of course, if we're talking about the scientific method here, we're discussing about the term empirical. And of course, the term empirical means from experience. So therefore, yes, exactly. If you have had these kind of experiences, you are in a far more important position to evaluate the phenomenon than somebody who is subjectively rejecting it because they don't believe it can happen. And of course, the problem is, just because we cannot scientifically explain how these happen doesn't mean they don't happen. It just means that our science is inadequate in its understanding of how the true nature of reality is.
Exactly. Well, this is about consciousness research, nature of consciousness, of course, but it is also the power of the lived experience. You see, yes. Because the very fact of having had the after-death communication is for them the proof. They call it a proof, not even evidence. No, it's a proof. They're sure that their significant other has survived bodily death, because they said, I have seen him, I heard him, I had this experience, I had this communication, I got the message, she told me, I am alive, I survived the death of my body and I'm well, I'm watching over you, I'm at your side, you're not alone in this difficult period of bereavement. So the very fact of having had the experience is for them the proof that yes, there is life after death, and that the contact was authentic and real, and nobody will make them change their mind, even if their interlocutors don't believe in it. Okay, fine. They know it is true for them.
Because again, thinking about this as a form of mechanism, and it's something that Sarah and myself, and I say other researchers that I work with on a regular basis is interested in, is the role of lucid dreaming, the role of out-of-body experiences, and the role of these non-ordinary states of consciousness. Yes. And I was just thinking when you were talking there that you could have the alternate scenario whereby the person who is deceased or is in this limbo state between life and death, or whatever we want to call it, is also dreaming, is communicating within their own dream state into somebody else's liminal state. And that's where the communication occurs, that both individuals, both the deceased person in raised commas, who is outside of time, is communicating with somebody who is also in a hypnagogic or a hypnopompic state. And that's where the communications take place. You know, it's when we're in this kind of overlapping place between whatever this reality is and whatever the reality is when we are no longer in the perceptual field of our loved ones. And of course, this tells us some intriguing things about the nature of consciousness, the nature of exactly what consciousness is. Yes. And whether consciousness and reality have a symbiotic relationship whereby it is all in reality, it is all what we would ordinarily call an hallucination state, because of course, all perceptual things we receive that the brain presents to us are technically hallucinatory states because they're all brain generated. So
yes, absolutely. Well, this is very interesting. Of course, this goes with a theory which you have elaborated for so many years and which I find extremely interesting. But I would say ADCs, you know, I think the nature of consciousness is really the main question we need to work on. And it's very interesting to see that so many researchers have taken up this subject, and there's so much going on now in the field of consciousness research in different fields, in different disciplines, and this is fascinating. So it's all about the nature of consciousness. And I think if you put all those, what they call anomalous experiences, I would call an ADC a very normal, very healthy experience, nothing extraordinary or anomalous, but well, that's the way they name them. If you put them in parallel, like near-death experiences, deathbed visions, after-death communications, what we learn from mediums, when we take all this together and we look at it in a more holistic way, then I think we get a better understanding of the nature of consciousness. So this is really part of a larger part of consciousness research, I would say.
Very wise words, I think, because I think this is the major point here, is that we are getting snapshots of a greater reality.
Exactly.
Is telling us things that we need to work together to understand exactly what is going on here. You know, effectively, we all carry the baggage of our own belief systems which we then apply to these things. And we should try to take them away from that and tell us just what is the phenomenon telling us.
Exactly. What is the phenomenon telling us, and what is the lived experience of people?
Yes.
What happens to them? How did it impact their life? What do they think now about life and death and nature of a reality? I think this is really the important question.
Well, it comes back, doesn't it? A previous guest on this show is Dr. Penny Satori. And of course, Penny,
oh, yes, Penny.
And Penny has recently written a book on the transformative effects of NDEs. And we know that individuals, when they have NDEs, as you will know as a world famous NDE researcher, and this is going to be my final question now, because again, time runs very quickly for us in terms of this. But I'm very interested in the overlap as somebody who has studied the near-death experience in all its variations, from your research with Ken Ring and various other people, to the after-death communications. What do you think the relationship is between what the NDE tells us about the nature of reality and after-death communications? Because one could assume that they are almost contradictory, but not. If you see my point, I'm just interested in your opinions on that.
Well, I think they tell us something about the afterlife. We still don't know exactly, of course, and maybe we will never know until we die. Maybe it's not a problem if we don't know it until we die. But what they tell us is, NDEers tell us that they entered this beautiful light, this being of light, and there was only knowledge and there was only love. And people had an ADC, the information they received, the message they received from the deceased person is, I am alive. That is the most important message. I am still alive and I am well. I am happy and I'm with you. And the bond of love which we had while I was alive is still there. I'm not there anymore physically, and it is sad, of course. It is heartbreaking. But I'm still there, I'm still with you. The bond is not broken, the connection is still there. And sometimes, not very often, in very, I would say, even moments of grace, I can materialize myself and come to you, and you can perceive me and we can talk. And I can make you feel the love I have for you, and you can feel the love you have for me, and there's this emotion, this love going on between the two of us. Although I'm not in a body anymore, and I will not be again. I mean, I will not come back. I died physically. But the connection between us, the bond between us is still there and will go on, and will go on probably for a very, very long time. I think this is very reassuring. So the message is the same from the near-death experience. What happens, what waits for us after death is love and light. And that's what the people learn from their deceased loved ones. I'm still alive and I'm well, I'm happy, and I'm with you, and love has survived physical death.
Okay, I suppose then the final question, well, not the final question, I'll throw it over to Sarah to ask a final question as well. But the question has to be asked as to why it only happens to certain people. You know, when you think that the millions of people who lose people,
Yes.
and they lose their mother and their father, and they always have a very powerful bond. Yes, why it is that those people don't communicate, even though the incentive to do so would be the same. So there must be some people must have an ability to communicate in this way, or a perceptual ability to sense these communications, do you think?
I don't think so. I think everybody can have an ADC. I think it has nothing to do with our belief system. It has nothing to do with a certain sensibility, like the mediums, they're very sensitive. I don't think it has something to do with that. I am sure that it is not an indicator of the relation between the person, the bereaved person, and the person who had died. I'm sure it is not, it doesn't mean that if you have an ADC with your deceased husband, your husband loved you so much that he came back and contacted you, whereas another widow would say, why didn't my husband come back and contact me? Maybe he didn't love me enough. I'm sure that has nothing to do with that.
Okay.
It's not an indicator of the quality and the intensity of the love that was between the person and the deceased person. I'm sure that is not the case. Because very often the relationship was not so close. You know, you can have an ADC with an elderly aunt who passed away. It was your aunt, you liked her, but you were not very close, and yet you have an ADC. We have all these figures. I present them in my book. It is not always a very, very close relationship. You can have an ADC with a person, somebody of your family, in most cases, yes, but maybe you were not so close with a person, yet you have the ADC, and the person you were very, very close with, you don't have the ADC. So we don't know.
But that's it, isn't it? The very point of your research is to discover more about these things.
But that's
the
what we're
whole
working
point of
at.
research, isn't it? You know, it's not to come up with answers, it's to analyze the detail and the facts we have. Sarah, have you got any other final points you'd like to make?
I was just going to say that everything you've been talking about today, Evelyn, really kind of confirms this idea, because I'm really interested in ancient cultures and why ancient people had such firm belief in the existence of an afterlife. And I do think that encounters like that and encounters in the lucid dream state with the deceased people would have convinced ancient people that the afterlife existed. I mean, one thing, we've had Gregory Shushan on here as well, and a lot of NDEs incorporate these trials. So some of them can be quite difficult. So I wondered if there's anything like that within the ADCs that you're talking about.
Well, when the relationship was bad and the ADC serves to fix a relationship, then it can be painful, because maybe it's the experience who didn't behave well with the person who is deceased. So all this is then, put on the table, and yes, it can be difficult, but we don't have many of those cases, I must say. Some found the experience to be frightening. Not many, small percentage, I think it was 12% found it frightening. But then we have made a paper on this specific subject, university in France, with Renaud Evrard from the University of Lorraine, and he looked into that very in detail. What happened when people perceived the ADC to be frightening. And in fact, what we found, it's not so much the content, it's not so much the experience itself which frightened them, it was more the fact that it happened. Because it's completely out of whatever they could imagine possible. If they have a materialistic perception of life, they think nothing exists after death, and then they have an apparition of a deceased family member or friend. It can be frightening at the moment, and then the experience unfolds, and there was this communication, there was these positive feelings, and then they say it was frightening at the beginning. Some of them said I was frightened, very much frightened at the beginning only. Or an apparition can also be very, very impressive. All of a sudden you have somebody walking into your living room. I mean, it is very impressive. So that can frighten the people, but it was more like it was an effect of the surprise. And once when it unfolded, it became less frightening to them.
It reminds me.
Or, excuse me, I just want to add, or what they say, I was not frightened at all during the contact, but afterwards I was frightened, because I thought, was I hallucinating? Am I going crazy? How could I have perceived my deceased brother, knowing that this is impossible? So they were frightened after the experience. Sorry for interrupting, Sarah.
I was just going to say, with regard to frightening ones, it reminds me of what I run an Egyptology lecture series, and one of the Egyptologists I've interviewed is a specialist on ancient Egyptian dream texts. And one of the texts she found was one of these letters from the dead, or letters to the dead rather. So it was a letter from someone who was getting harassed by someone in his dreams, which he had done certain things that he would feel guilty about in his life. He was like beating this servant up, and he was being harassed in his dreams. And this person, a deceased person, was coming into his dreams and scaring him at night. So he'd written this letter and left it in the tomb of the deceased, saying, "Stop harassing me." My dream. So I wonder, with, you know, if the event is generated by the deceased person, it's interesting that there aren't more aggressive ones, especially in the case of maybe someone who's murdered someone, for example.
So we had very few cases when we saw that, yes, indeed, it was a little bit threatening, but all those cases happened with people who perceived deceased persons they didn't know. I think, for example, of the case of one of our participants who was a girl. She was about 12 when she saw an elderly man sitting in her, or standing in her bedroom, when she was woken up by the fact that the deceased person was there staring at her, and she was very, very frightened, and she shouted, and her father told her to keep quiet and to get back to sleep. And then, but he was still there for a couple of minutes. And she said, this happened 34 years ago, and I still remember how frightened I was when this happened to me when I was a child. So what can be really frightening and threatening for the people is when it happens with a deceased a person they don't know.
Which is an interesting aside again, isn't it? Right. Okay. Well, we're about to wind up now. We've had our hour. As always, Sarah and I always say this, that we cause time dilation when we do this show, because it seems to be about 3 minutes, you know, and we always end up wanting more, because the you know, it's just fascinating, the information we're being told. So Evelyn, for anybody who's interested in your work, your contact details, more details about the book, please share it with us now. It'd be wonderful to hear.
Yes, so I have a website, that's my name, Evelyn-Elsaesser.com, and we have just set up in January a dedicated website for our research project. It is not completely the way we want it to be, but there's already a lot of information there. And it's ADC Research Project, so it's adcrp.org.
Excellent.
And there we have all our publications. We have some of our videos, of our audios. In the news, we have our activities, and of course, an explanation of what are ADCs and what our research project is about.
Wonderful. I'll make sure that we get that the link up on both on Facebook and also on the subsequent YouTube.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Okay, Evelyn, as always, I really miss you so much, being able to just talk to you and everything else as well. So we must stay in contact. And as always, Sarah, thank you very much for your support on this as well. So everybody, thanks again for listening in to the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. If anybody's interested in following up on this, we've got Evelyn's website, and also tomorrow this will be uploaded onto my YouTube channel, where you can watch it for free for as long as you like. And please, please, please let more people know about this. If you have friends and associates that you feel that a program like this might make them feel better, they're suffering from bereavement or whatever, this is what we're here for. Okay, and we are non-judgmental. All we're trying to do is to understand this mystery of what it is being human and experiencing, and all we really know is we are something experiencing something, and everything else is a complete and utter mystery, and we're just trying to understand. Okay, thanks everybody, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.